June 6, 1944. The gray dawn rolled over the French coastline like a shroud of cold steel. The winds howled through the dunes of Normandy, carrying with them the faint rumble of engines, an echo that grew with every passing second. Inside bunker WN-62, 20-year-old Franz Gockel, an ordinary German soldier, blinked through the narrow slit of his machine gun post. The horizon was moving, but not with the tides. It was alive, with ships, hundreds of them, thousands. For weeks, the men of the 716th Infantry Division had been told the Allies would come. The propaganda films, the officers' briefings, even the locals whispered it. But none of them, least of all Gockel, imagined what invasion really looked like until this very moment. At first, he thought it was a mirage. The sheer size of it defied imagination. A horizon made of steel. The ocean itself seemed buried beneath the armada that had appeared overnight. He froze. His hands trembled against the MG42's cold grip. What he saw wasn't a battle. It was the end of the world. For months, the Atlantic Wall had been Hitler's obsession. From Norway to the Bay of Biscay, from Calais to Cherbourg, millions of tons of concrete and steel had been poured into fortifications that promised to make Europe impenetrable. Gockel's bunker, Widerstands Nest 62, Resistance Nest 62, was one of those dots on the map, a small cog in a massive machine of war. Yet that morning, WN-62 became one of the most important and terrifying places on Earth. The men stationed there were not elite SS troops. They were young, tired, and under-equipped soldiers, some still recovering from the Eastern Front, others foreign conscripts drafted into a war they barely understood. Gockel, just 19 when he first joined, had been posted to Normandy in 1943. He wasn't a fanatical Nazi. He was a boy who wanted to survive. He had grown up in the quiet town of Aachen, working in a family bakery before the draft notice came. When he arrived at the coast, he found himself part of Company 2, 716th Infantry Division, commanded by Oberleutnant Bernhard Frerking. His post at WN-62 was cramped, dark, and damp. The bunker's concrete walls oozed moisture. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and rust. The MG42s sat mounted, their barrels cleaned daily, aimed toward the beaches below. For months, they had stared at the empty sea. But now, the sea was staring back. The clock struck 5:30 a.m., and the first shells began to fall. The Allied fleet opened fire, an orchestra of thunder that split the dawn apart. Battleships, destroyers, and cruisers unleashed everything they had. The ground convulsed. Earth and concrete rained from the ceiling. Gockel ducked, covering his head as shockwaves tore through the bunker. He shouted for his comrades, Heinrich, Rudi, Kraus, but their voices were lost in the chaos. He couldn't see the sea anymore. Only smoke. Flames danced where the horizon used to be. The bombardment lasted for over 30 minutes, though it felt like eternity. Every impact brought the bunker closer to collapse. The lights flickered. The air turned thick with dust, and somewhere above them, the ground was shredded by fire and steel. Then, suddenly, silence. For a moment, only the sound of waves returned. Then came a new sound, the distant drone of engines, followed by the clatter of metal on water. Through his rangefinder, Gockel saw them. Landing craft, hundreds of them, moving toward the beaches. The water boiled with motion. Men were packed shoulder to shoulder, each boat slicing toward Omaha Beach. He turned to Frerking, who simply nodded. Fire at will, came the order. The MG42 roared to life, its mechanical scream echoing across the cliffs. The first bursts tore through the morning mist, striking the waves, splintering wood, and cutting down the first wave of soldiers before they even reached the sand. Gockel had fired before, in training, at the range, even in small skirmishes, but nothing like this. He wasn't shooting at targets. He was shooting at faces, at men who looked barely older than himself. The gun barrel glowed red. Shell casings clinked off the floor like metallic rain. Smoke filled the bunker, and Gockel's eye stung from the gunpowder. Down below, chaos unfolded. Landing craft exploded as mortars struck them mid-sea. The survivors jumped overboard, wading through neck-deep water under a hail of machine gun fire. Some never resurfaced. Others crawled onto the sand, dragging themselves behind obstacles that offered little protection. The sea turned red. But despite the slaughter, the Americans kept coming, wave after wave. It was as if the ocean itself was spitting out men. For every soldier who fell, 2 more appeared behind him. At one point, Gockel's gun jammed. In that fleeting pause, he looked down at the carnage, bodies strewn across the beach, medics trying to pull the wounded to safety, officers shouting through the chaos. Something inside him broke. He wasn't fighting soldiers anymore. He was fighting ghosts. He shouted for ammunition, his voice hoarse, his ears ringing. Another soldier shoved a new belt into the MG42. The rhythm of death resumed. Above the roar, he could hear American artillery finding its range. The shells landed closer and closer until the ground beneath him heaved like a living thing. Concrete cracked. The bunker shook. By 8 o'clock in the morning, most of WN-62's communication lines were dead. Their field telephone was useless. The line to battalion headquarters had been cut hours ago. They were alone, and yet they kept firing. The first Americans who made it to the foot of the cliffs were members of the 29th Infantry Division. They used explosives to clear wire obstacles, scaling the bluffs under direct fire. Gockel watched in disbelief as they clawed their way upward. Muddy, bloodied, determined. These weren't just soldiers. They were men who had crossed an ocean to fight him on his doorstep. One by one, the defensive nests around WN-62 began to fall silent. Machine guns overheated, ammunition ran low, and bodies piled up inside the trenches. Fraking was killed when a shell hit the command bunker. Gockel barely survived the blast, his uniform torn, his ears bleeding, his arm burned. He crawled back to his post, clutching the MG42, firing one last burst down the slope before the gun finally died. By noon, the battle for Omaha Beach had turned. The Americans, against impossible odds, had broken through. When Gockel finally abandoned his position, he stumbled through smoke and rubble, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He could barely hear. His world was reduced to a ringing void, filled with the smell of death and gunpowder. He looked back at WN-62 one last time. The bunker that had once felt invincible was now a tomb. Franz Gockel stumbled out of the ruins of WN-62, the air still thick with smoke and ash. His uniform was tattered, his face blackened from soot and gunpowder. Every breath burned, every sound felt distant, as if the world had been swallowed in a heavy fog. He had survived one of the deadliest hours in modern history, but survival came with no glory, only disbelief. He made his way down the slope, stepping over shattered helmets, torn webbing, and the twisted remains of weapons. The sand that morning had been pale gold. Now it was soaked dark red. Bodies lay in clusters, some face down in the surf, others tangled in barbed wire, motionless. Gockel had seen death before, but never like this. Never so human, so close. These weren't faceless enemies. These were young men, some barely out of school, who had crossed the sea with nothing but courage and orders. He dropped his weapon, the MG42, his lifeline, his purse, clattered into the dirt. He didn't want to carry it anymore. By early afternoon, the Allied troops had secured the beachhead. Small units began pushing inland, clearing the remnants of German resistance. Gockel, alone and disoriented, was found near the edge of the bluffs by an American patrol. They raised their rifles. He raised his hands. The war, for him, was over. When the Americans searched him, they found nothing unusual. No documents, no medals, just a photo tucked inside his tunic. A young girl, smiling, holding a small loaf of bread. His sister, Anna, one of the American soldiers, looked at it for a moment before slipping it back into his pocket. There was no hatred in his eyes, only exhaustion. Gockel was marched away with other prisoners. They passed wrecked tanks, burned-out landing craft, and medical teams still dragging the wounded from the tide. He remembered the sound, the endless hum of engines and cries, blending into a single haunting note that never seemed to end. That night, the sky over Normandy glowed orange with fire. From his temporary holding camp, Gockel watched as tracer rounds arced across the horizon. And for the first time, he realized what he had truly been part of. It wasn't a heroic defense. It wasn't about victory or ideology. It was a storm of suffering, shared by men on both sides who never asked for it. In the days that followed, Gockel was interrogated by Allied intelligence. They wanted details, troop numbers, bunker layouts, defenses along the coast, but he had little to offer. WN-62 had been his entire world. He spoke little. Mostly, he stared at the walls, lost in thought. He remembered the faces of his comrades, Frecking, Heinrich, Rudy, men who had joked, shared cigarettes, written letters home. Men who had vanished in minutes. When asked how long he had fired his machine gun on D-Day, he said quietly, 6 hours, maybe more. I don't know. Time stopped. The Allied officer nodded, writing something down. But to Gockel, the conversation didn't matter. Nothing could erase the images from that morning. He later learned that over 2,000 American soldiers had been killed or wounded on Omaha Beach. At his position alone, WN-62, the defenders numbered less than 30 men. By the end of the day, only 2 survived, Gockel and one other. For the rest of the war, he was held as a prisoner, first in France, then in England. He was treated fairly, given food, even books to read. But his mind never left Normandy. He replayed those hours endlessly, trying to understand what it all meant. When the war ended in 1945 and Germany surrendered, Gockel was just 21 years old. He returned home to Aachen, but the city he remembered was gone, bombed to rubble. His family's bakery had been destroyed, his father dead, his sister missing. He found work as a laborer, then later as a construction worker. The years passed quietly. He married, raised children, tried to rebuild some sense of peace. But the memories followed him always. He never boasted about his time at Omaha Beach. He didn't see himself as a hero nor a villain. He was a witness to the cost of blind obedience and to the futility of war. In 1960, he returned to Normandy. The beaches had changed. Tourists walked where the waves had once carried the dead. Children played in the sand. Flowers grew over the bunkers. Gockel climbed the same hill where WN-62 still stood, now half-buried and silent. He placed his hand on the cold concrete and whispered, "Ich habe überlebt." I survived. Nearby, a group of American veterans stood, gazing out to sea. One of them noticed him, a small, quiet man with gray hair and tired eyes, and walked over. Neither spoke for a long time. They just looked at the horizon together. Finally, the American said, "Hell of a day, wasn't it?" Gockel nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "The longest day." They shook hands. Two former enemies, bound forever by one shared memory. Over the years, Gockel would give a few interviews. He spoke not of battles, but of the people, of the fear, the confusion, the humanity on both sides. He said, "War isn't made by soldiers. It's made by those who never see the battlefield. We only live it." He lived a quiet life until his passing in 2005. But his story endures, not as propaganda, not as glorification, but as a reminder that history isn't written only by generals or politicians. It's written by men like Franz Gockel, ordinary soldiers caught in extraordinary moments. And as time moves forward, the bunkers at Omaha remain. The tide washes over them, eroding their edges, but their silence speaks louder than any monument. They remind us of what happens when humanity forgets its limits. They remind us of courage, sacrifice, and the fragile line between duty and conscience. Every visitor who walks that beach today stands where thousands once fell. And perhaps, if they listen closely, they can still hear the whispers of that dawn when the fate of the free world hung by a thread. As the echoes of Normandy fade into the sea, we're left with the same haunting question: how many ordinary lives were swallowed by extraordinary madness? If this story moved you, if it reminded you that behind every uniform was a beating heart, then stay with us, because there are countless more stories buried beneath the ashes of history, waiting to be told. Subscribe now and join us on our next journey into the hidden battles, forgotten faces, and untold truths of World War II. And before you go, stay a moment longer. Watch one of the documentaries on your screen right now. Every click keeps these memories alive and ensures their voices are never forgotten.